The roar of the crowd was deafening, a pulsating wave of anticipation that swept through the arena like a living, breathing thing. Cameras flashed with feverish intensity, their sharp bursts of light painting chaotic streaks across the faces of spectators, each one eager to witness the clash of legends. This wasn't just another headline fight. It was a collision of two icons from entirely different worlds, bound by their unrelenting hunger to prove something both to themselves and to everyone watching. Mike Tyson, the name alone sent chills down spines. The man who redefined brutality in the ring, whose fists spoke louder than any words ever could. Age had weathered him, perhaps softened the edges of his once titanic physique, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed. If anything, the passing years had only sharpened his hunger, transforming it into something colder, more calculated. He entered the ring with the same feral intensity that made him a living nightmare to opponents during his prime. The way he moved was nothing short of haunting smooth, almost effortless, yet carrying the unmistakable promise of devastation. Opposite him stood Chris Jericho, the self-proclaimed Ayatollah of rock and roll. A man who built his empire in a world where charisma was as vital as skill. Wrestling wasn't just sport to Jericho, it was art, theater, a spectacle meant to dazzle. But beneath the bravado and theatrics, there was real power. He was no stranger to pain, no novice when it came to pushing his body to the limit. And though critics scoffed at the idea of a professional wrestler stepping into the ring with someone like Tyson, Jericho's resolve was unbreakable. He thrived in chaos, relished in the challenge, and seemed to grow stronger under the weight of doubt. The fight had drawn eyes from every corner of the globe. Sports analysts debated endlessly about whether Jericho's unconventional training could possibly prepare him for the savagery of a boxing match against Tyson. Social media platforms were a war zone of speculation and heated arguments, the kind of fervor that only came with something truly unprecedented. To Jericho's followers, this was more than a fight. It was proof that their hero could conquer any arena he stepped into. For Tyson's loyalists, it was a reckless stunt that would end in merciless humiliation for the wrestler. But to Tyson himself, it was something else entirely. This fight wasn't about shutting up critics or padding his legacy. It was about reclaiming something he'd lost, something intangible yet essential. There had been too many quiet nights where he stared at the ceiling, feeling the ache of irrelevance creeping in like a disease. Fighting Jericho was his way of setting the world straight, of proving to himself that his fists still held the power to command respect. Jericho, on the other hand, thrived on the absurdity of it all. His mouth never seemed to stop moving in the weeks leading up to the fight, spouting taunts and promises in equal measure. It was all part of the performance, a psychological game he played to perfection. But behind the bombast and sarcasm, he took the challenge seriously. Boxing was foreign territory, but pain was universal. And pain, he believed, was something he understood better than most. Their press conference had been a spectacle of its own. Tyson's gaze remained cold, unreadable, while Jericho paced and prowled like a caged predator, goading him with insults meant to sting. The media ate it up, their headlines painting Jericho as either a brave fool or a cunning showman who had found the perfect way to sell the fight. Tyson's silence only made it worse. It was as if his restraint itself was a threat, a coiled spring waiting to snap. As the night of the fight approached, the atmosphere in the arena grew electric. Fans packed into their seats, eyes glued to the ring as if fearing they might miss a moment of history. Celebrities and sports icons crowded the front rows, their faces lit with anticipation and, in some cases, morbid curiosity. Tyson emerged first, flanked by his team yet somehow feeling utterly alone. His expression was pure steel, an intensity that silenced the crowd's cheers and jeers alike. Every movement was deliberate, heavy with purpose. Jericho followed moments later, his entrance designed to provoke and entertain. Music blared through the speakers, his name chanted by those who adored his audacity. Yet even as he played to the crowd, there was an edge to his demeanor, a grimness that belied his casual swagger. For all his theatrics, he knew the stakes were real. He knew the pain Tyson could unleash, knew that the ring offered no forgiveness for those who came unprepared. They met in the center of the ring, eyes locking with the kind of intensity that seemed to freeze time itself. The referee's voice sounded distant, drowned out by the pounding of their own heartbeats. Tyson's fists twitched with a predatory impatience, while Jericho's muscles tensed like coiled wire, ready to explode at the first opportunity. They didn't exchange words. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered would be spoken with fists. The bell rang, and the world held its breath. Tyson surged forward, his footwork quicker than anyone expected, his movements deceptively smooth. Jericho's instincts kicked in, his wrestling reflexes forcing him to pivot and dodge, his arms raised defensively as he gauged the beast before him. But Tyson was relentless, pressing forward with a ferocity that made the ring feel smaller with every passing second. Jericho absorbed the onslaught with surprising resilience, his footwork awkward but effective. His style was unconventional, a mishmash of techniques that seemed designed to frustrate and confuse. He slipped punches by mere inches, dodging with an agility that surprised even his harshest critics. But Tyson's power was undeniable, each missed punch a testament to the devastation that would follow if one of them connected cleanly. The first round was a whirlwind of motion and brutality. Jericho's attempts at countering were met with bone-rattling jabs that forced him back, each impact chipping away at his stamina. But the wrestler refused to buckle. He fought like a man cornered, his survival instincts honed by years of performing in front of unforgiving crowds. Tyson's eyes narrowed with every successful dodge, his frustration mounting. He hadn't expected Jericho to last this long, to counter with such resilience. It was a test of endurance, as much as skill, and for the first time in years, Tyson felt something he hadn't felt since his prime uncertainty. But then, just as the crowd began to sense a shift in momentum, Tyson unleashed a hook so fast and brutal that the air itself seemed to shudder. The punch connected with sickening precision, and Jericho's head snapped back, his legs betraying him as he stumbled. Yet somehow, impossibly, he didn't go down. And the look in his eyes was one Tyson recognized all too well: defiance. Jericho's eyes burned with a wild intensity, a defiant flame refusing to be snuffed out. The punch that had rattled his skull would have dropped most fighters, but he was still standing. Staggered, yes, but not broken. The crowd erupted, their voices clashing in a frenzied mixture of awe and disbelief. No one had expected him to survive a direct hit from Tyson, much less steady himself so quickly. It was as if the pain only fueled him, forcing his body to respond with a desperation rooted in something far deeper than skill alone. Tyson pressed forward, his instincts commanding him to capitalize on the opening. He unleashed a rapid flurry of punches, fists cutting through the air with a ferocity that felt almost reckless. But Jericho was no longer simply trying to evade or endure. He countered with swift, unexpected jabs of his own, not powerful enough to do real damage, but precise enough to slow Tyson's relentless advance. His strikes were awkward, almost clumsy by boxing standards, but there was a method to the madness, a rhythm Tyson couldn't quite pin down. The audience watched, enraptured by the brutal dance unfolding before them. Every punch seemed to carry the weight of something more than just the fight itself. For Tyson, it was about reclaiming the legacy he felt slipping through his fingers. For Jericho, it was about proving himself in an arena designed to see him fail. And for those watching, it was an impossible spectacle, a clash of two men who should never have met in the ring, yet here they were, pushing each other to their limits. Jericho's unconventional approach was working, if only just. His movements were unpredictable, his strikes unorthodox enough to disrupt Tyson's flow. But Tyson's power remained a constant threat, a coiled viper ready to strike with lethal precision. The sheer force behind his punches was staggering, each blow that landed chipping away at Jericho's endurance. Tyson's frustration was becoming palpable. His punches grew more vicious, his gaze darkening with every failed attempt to put Jericho down for good. The resilience displayed by his opponent was something he hadn't prepared for, something that defied the simple narrative of a boxer crushing a wrestler. And that defiance only seemed to ignite something within him, a reminder of the battles he'd fought long ago, against opponents who refused to surrender until the final bell. Jericho, battered but unyielding, began to find moments of opportunity amidst the chaos. Tyson's impatience was leaving gaps brief, fleeting windows of vulnerability that Jericho exploited with ruthless determination. A jab to the ribs here, a glancing hook there. Nothing that would stop Tyson, but enough to make him hesitate, even if just for a split second. It was during one of those desperate exchanges that Jericho unveiled something no one expected. Tyson threw a thunderous right hook, but Jericho, instead of simply dodging, shifted his weight and twisted Tyson's arm with a sudden, fluid motion. The maneuver wasn't legal by boxing standards, but it was brilliantly subtle, just enough to disrupt Tyson's momentum and force him to stumble backward. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Commentators scrambled to make sense of what they had just witnessed, their voices clashing over the legality of Jericho's move. It was wrestling bleeding into boxing, the two worlds colliding in a way that left everyone questioning what rules, if any, still applied. Tyson's eyes narrowed, fury and bewilderment intertwining across his expression. He charged again, his fists swinging with brutal precision. But Jericho was no longer trying to match him punch for punch. Instead, he danced along the edge of legality, weaving his wrestling instincts into the fight with a precision that was both brazen and brilliant. His footwork became unpredictable, his counters infused with subtle grapples and holds that threw Tyson's timing into disarray. The strategy was a gamble, a calculated risk that could easily backfire. Tyson's raw power remained a constant danger, every failed maneuver threatening to end the fight in a heartbeat. But Jericho thrived under pressure. The chaos he created became his armor, his unpredictability, a weapon Tyson couldn't seem to neutralize. Spectators began to pick sides with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. Some hailed Jericho's tactics as genius, a masterstroke of adaptability that showcased his resilience and creativity. Others condemned it as desperation, a cheap ploy designed to undermine the purity of the sport. But whatever their opinions, no one could deny that the fight had become something entirely different, something that transcended the boundaries of boxing and wrestling alike. Tyson's fists crashed against Jericho's defenses with a force that sent shudders through the canvas. But Jericho kept moving, his endurance proving as formidable as his cunning. His body bore the bruises of Tyson's assault, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, but the defiance in his eyes never wavered. It was a clash of styles as much as wills, and neither man seemed willing to relent. But then, amid the relentless barrage, something shifted. Jericho, in a moment of sheer audacity, closed the distance between them, locking Tyson's arm in a maneuver so sudden and precise it left the crowd gasping. Tyson tried to pull free, but Jericho's grip held firm, his strength born not of brute force, but of leverage and technique. It was a move he'd perfected over years of grappling, applied now in a context that had never been meant to accommodate it. Tyson's eyes flared with outrage, his muscles straining against Jericho's hold. It was a clash of sheer power against calculated technique, each man struggling to assert dominance over the other. And then, just as Tyson broke free with a roar of fury, Jericho unleashed a counterstrike that landed squarely on Tyson's jaw, clean, brutal, and unexpected. Tyson staggered, the impact enough to force him backward, his expression twisted with something that bordered on disbelief. The crowd erupted, their cheers and gasps blending into a deafening storm of noise. But even as the applause thundered through the arena, Tyson's gaze remained locked on Jericho, his fists tightening with renewed purpose. What had been a spectacle was now a war. Tyson's fury was unrestrained, his movements sharpening with a ruthless precision that sent chills through the audience. And Jericho, for all his cleverness and resilience, was beginning to show the wear of the battle. But there was something in his eyes, a determination that refused to flicker, even as Tyson bore down on him with the force of a freight train. The fight was far from over, and both men knew it. But as Tyson surged forward once more, his fists clenched with merciless intent, it became clear that whatever happened next would change everything. Tyson's punches came with the fury of a storm, each strike aimed at tearing down whatever walls Jericho had managed to construct. The relentless onslaught drove Jericho to the ropes, his body sagging under the weight of the punishment. Yet, even as his arms trembled with fatigue and his legs threatened to buckle, he refused to yield. Tyson's attacks were devastating, his fists hammering away with a ferocity that spoke of a man determined to end the fight in his favor. But for all his raw power, there was something almost reckless about his assault now, an urgency born of frustration. Jericho sensed it. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he recognized the cracks forming in Tyson's approach. The punches were still powerful, but the precision had begun to waver, the rhythm faltering as Tyson tried to break through Jericho's stubborn resilience. It was then that Jericho made his move, a desperate, calculated gamble born of instinct and sheer willpower. He feigned a stumble, letting his body sag forward just enough to bait Tyson into committing to a crushing uppercut. As Tyson's fist arced upward, Jericho twisted his body to the side, letting the blow skim past his shoulder. In the same breath, he surged forward, his shoulder slamming into Tyson's chest with unexpected force. It was a maneuver rooted in wrestling, an unorthodox tactic that threw Tyson off balance just long enough for Jericho to retaliate. The counterattack was vicious and precise. Jericho's fist drove into Tyson's ribs, the impact deep enough to force a grunt from the legendary fighter. The crowd erupted, their voices rising in a collective gasp as Jericho seized the moment, his strikes coming with a ferocity that mirrored Tyson's own. But Jericho's assault wasn't about brute strength. It was about endurance, about using every scrap of energy he had left to turn the tide. Tyson fought back with the desperation of a cornered predator, his fists lashing out with a savagery that left the audience on edge. But Jericho was no longer simply trying to survive. He was fighting to win. His punches came faster, more deliberate, aimed at exploiting the subtle weaknesses he'd noticed throughout the bout. Tyson's power was undeniable, but Jericho's persistence had started to chip away at the legend's armor. And then it happened. A perfectly timed strike from Jericho connected with Tyson's jaw, a clean, brutal hit that left Tyson stumbling backward. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity, the arena falling into a stunned silence as Tyson's legs wobbled beneath him. But even then, Tyson's strength was a force unto itself. He steadied himself, his gaze locking onto Jericho with a determination that bordered on madness. The two fighters clashed once more, their bodies colliding in a final desperate exchange. Tyson's fists continued to pound away, but Jericho's movements had grown sharper, his reflexes fueled by a resilience that refused to fade. And then, as if guided by some unspoken instinct, Jericho unleashed a combination that left the crowd breathless. His punches flowed together with a precision that seemed almost impossible for someone who had been pushed to the brink. A jab to Tyson's ribs, followed by a hook that rattled the side of his head. Tyson tried to counter, but Jericho slipped beneath the strike, his fist driving into Tyson's abdomen with enough force to make the legend gasp. The impact sent Tyson staggering backward, his arms dropping just enough for Jericho to deliver one final, devastating uppercut. Tyson hit the canvas, his body crashing down with a weight that shook the ring itself. The crowd exploded into a frenzy, their disbelief giving way to deafening applause. The referee's count felt agonizingly slow, each number hanging in the air like a challenge. But Tyson remained down, his chest heaving with the effort of trying to push himself back to his feet. By the time the count reached 10, the fight was over. Jericho stood there, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, his eyes locked on Tyson's fallen form. It was a victory that defied expectation, a triumph born not from overwhelming strength, but from sheer tenacity. As the referee raised Jericho's arm, the crowd roared its approval, their cheers washing over him like a tidal wave. But as the celebrations erupted around him, Jericho couldn't help but glance down at Tyson, who was now sitting up, his expression a mixture of pain and grudging respect. Tyson's gaze met Jericho's, and for a moment, the animosity of the fight melted away. Tyson extended his hand, his voice rough but genuine as he spoke. "You earned it, kid. More than anyone I've ever faced." The handshake that followed carried a weight greater than any punch. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition of the struggle they had both endured. Tyson's respect was a prize Jericho hadn't expected but valued more than anything else. But just as Jericho began to bask in the thrill of his improbable victory, an announcement echoed through the arena, cutting through the cheers with brutal clarity. The commissioner's voice crackled over the speakers, declaring that Jericho's tactics had been deemed illegal. The hybrid maneuvers he'd used, those subtle wrestling holds and unorthodox counters, had been ruled as violations of the rules. The crowd's applause faltered, confusion rippling through the stands. Jericho's expression shifted from triumph to disbelief as the implications sank in. His victory, the triumph he had fought so hard for, was now under scrutiny. Tyson's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable as the officials debated their decision. The final verdict came with a cruel swiftness. Jericho's win was overturned, his efforts dismissed as nothing more than a violation of tradition. The official result was declared a disqualification, the audience left grappling with an ending no one had anticipated. Tyson's name was restored as the victor, but even he seemed unsatisfied by the outcome. As Jericho stood there, surrounded by the chaos of conflicting voices and shattered expectations, Tyson approached him once more. "Rules or no rules, that was a damn fight," Tyson said, his voice low but firm. "You proved something out there. To everyone, including me." Jericho met Tyson's gaze, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. The fight might have been stolen from him by the judges, but the respect he had earned was real. And in that moment, he realized that true victory wasn't always defined by the record books. Sometimes, it was about proving you could stand your ground against the very best. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every expression, every emotion. And as the crowd's reaction shifted from confusion to applause, Jericho knew his journey was far from over. The world had seen him rise against all odds, and that was something no ruling could ever erase.